Saxton Pope and Art Young are two of the most important and influential figures in American archery history. Saxton Pope was a medical doctor in California in the early 1900s. He became interested in archery after meeting Ishi, the last member of the Yana tribe and a man who survived his whole life through his skills with the bow and arrow. Dr. Pope studied and documented every aspect of Ishi's archery equipment and quickly adopted the English yew longbow as his hunting weapon of choice. Pope went on many longbow hunting adventures with his friend Art Young, including black bear and deer in California, grizzly bears in Yellowstone, and eventually lion in Africa. In 1923, just 3 years before his death, Saxton Pope wrote a book titled Hunting with the Bow and Arrow. In this book, he describes Ishi's archery equipment, describes how to make his own archery equipment, and tells stories of his many hunting adventures. In Chapter 6 of his book titled How to Make an Arrow, Saxton Pope writes that there are innumerable types of arrows and equal number of ways to make them. Pope states that having studied several Aboriginal methods to fletch arrows and studying all available literature on the subject, he has adopted the following maneuvers to turn out standard hunting arrows. He would make his arrows out of a 3/8 inch diameter birch dowel that he would get from the hardware store. These birch dowels were carefully selected to be straight, free of cross grain, and of a rigid quality. Pope would cut these dowels to a length of 28 1/4 inches in length, and in doing so, making sure to remove the worst end, and keeping the end with the straightest grain for the head of the shaft. Having cut them to length, he would taper the last 6 inches of the shaft so that it was sanded down to a diameter slightly more than 5/16 of an inch. Nocking the shaft will come next. To form his nocks, Pope would simply place the smaller end of the shaft in a vise and cut across the grain with 3 hacksaw blades bound together. The finished cut was about 1/8 of an inch wide and 3/8 of an inch deep. He would then finish the nock with a file and run sandpaper along all the edges until they were smooth and had a graceful appearance. Now it is time to paint the end of your arrow shaft. Pope marked his arrows with several different colors and designs throughout his lifetime, but preferred a color scheme that consisted of a red base and alternating black and white lines as seen here. Now you are ready to fletch your arrow. Pope preferred to use turkey feathers, but would use feathers from a goose if turkey feathers were not available. Pope writes that cutting arrow feathers is a pleasant occupation around the fire in a winter evening, and the real archer has happiness in making his tackle while his mind dwells upon the coming spring shooting season. To make his fletchings, Pope describes in his book that he would cut the feather to length, split the quill in half, and then shave down the bottom of the quill with a pocket knife until it was smooth. He would then trim the wide base of the quill and cut the feather fletchings to shape using a pair of scissors. Pope writes that now comes the difficult task of putting on the feathers. He states that many ways and means have been devised to do this task, however he prefers the oldest of methods, which is depicted of that on Old English paintings. This method consists of binding the feathers with a piece of thread running spirally up the shaft between the bristles. Starting at a point 6 inches from the nock, set the thick end of the rib of the feather into position and cover them with a thin layer of glue. After a few turns with the thread, proceed up the shaftment, adjusting the feathers into position as you rotate the arrow. Let the thread slip between the bristles of the feathers about a half an inch apart. When you come to the end of your fletchings, finish with several overlapping turns and a half hitch. When the glue is dry, you can remove the spiral wrap of thread. Pope would then further secure the fletchings by binding the front and base of the feathers with a tight wrapping of fine silk thread. He would cover this wrapping of silk thread with a layer of glue. Having brought your arrows to this stage, the next act is to trim the feathers. First, run them gently through the hand and smooth out the vanes. Then, with long-bladed scissors, cut them so that the interior end is 3/8 of an inch high, while the posterior extremity is 1 inch. Pope would also cut the rear end of the feather diagonally across, removing about a half an inch to prevent it from getting in the way of the fingers while it is on the string. Pope writes that at this stage he added a device which seems to be helpful in nocking the arrow in the dark or while keeping his eye on game. Having put a drop of glue on the ribbon immediately above the nock and behind the cock feather, he affixed a small white glass bead. One can feel this with the thumb as he nocks his arrow. When in conjunction with the knots on his string, he can perform the maneuver of nocking and shooting an arrow entirely by touch. The main part of your arrow is now complete. The final stage is to attach a point or hunting broadhead to your arrow and you are ready to shoot. I'll describe in part 2 of this video series how Saxton Pope made these hunting broadheads.